Welcome to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm your host, John Davidson, political editor at the Federalist, and I'm joined today by Dr. Larry Arnn, president of Hillsdale College, which I should say at the outset, full disclosure, is my alma mater, class of 2004. Dr. Arnn, welcome to the program today.
Great to be with you, John.
We are going to talk about the Federalist's 1620 project, which we launched just before Thanksgiving, a series of essays, podcasts, interviews, and articles about the landing at Plymouth Rock, about the Pilgrims, the Mayflower Compact, and really the beginning of the American story. Dr. Arnn, I wanted to have you come on and talk to us about that, not just because Hillsdale College has played, especially in recent years, such a big role in reviving the ideas and the spirit of the American founding, but also because we're living in a time when the spirit of the American founding in the mainstream culture is not necessarily something to revere or something that is considered salutary, but is maybe something that we should apologize for. So maybe we can just begin there. And the obvious comparison to our 1620 project would be the New York Times' 1619 project. If you could maybe just start off our discussion with a comment about the distinction between the frame of the 1619 project and something like our 1620 project.
Well, the 1619 project is an exercise in despotism of the kind described in the novel 1984. Their initial position was they discovered the true key to the American founding. But it turns out that claim is nonsense on its face, as was proved by the very noble efforts, for example, of Gordon Wood, a very distinguished historian. And so now their position is that was a posture that they took to affect the present. And the whole thing in 1984 is that the past is malleable and we can use the past. The past is in our control. What is the doctrine of the Big Brother regime? He who controls the past controls. He who controls the present controls the past, and he who controls the past controls the future. So, this temper is evident everywhere in America. Scholarship, academic things, are supposed to begin by looking at the thing that they're trying to understand and gain a better understanding. Journalism is supposed to be the story of the day. What happened today? As it truly happened. So we now are all in a contest who can be powerful. The purpose of the New York Times project, on its face, is to exercise and influence a power on the future, not to tell a truth about the past.
That's right. It strikes me as fundamentally political, not historical. And so it's not really related to the purposes of journalism, but it's also not really related to the purposes of history, because it is fundamentally a political project and is concerned, like much of the left, with power, as you say. That's not what we're trying to do, and as our publisher Ben Domenech noted in our opening 1620 introductory essay, the purpose of the 1620 project isn't to refute the 1619 project, because the 1619 project is self-refuting and has already been repudiated by its own creators after getting pushback. They sort of walked back their claim that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery, which is ridiculous, and was called out by many historians as such. But that leaves us with the 1620 project and the importance of 1620. And I wanted to talk to you especially about the interplay or the correct understanding of 1620 together with 1776, the nation's founding. I think that we have to look back to the Mayflower Compact, and we have to look back to those first pilgrims who arrived in 1620 as the start of an American project, as a nascent American project, but that our true founding as a nation belongs and will always be 1776. Maybe you can comment on the interplay and the relationship between these two monumentous dates and how they affect one another.
Well, the Declaration of Independence is, of course, a culmination, a beautiful culmination of 150 years of learning on the new continent. The Mayflower Compact, which is arguably the first deliberate act, that is to say, act of legislation, of common policy making in the New World. And it's extremely telling. I'd like to say that if you want to understand the American Revolution, you have to watch the great old Westerns, because they're always the same. Like Liberty Valance, one of the best of them. There are two things in that town that contend for authority: a law book and a gun. And the town is incapable of producing either. They brought it with them, right? And so it never happened before in history, and it actually can't happen again, that a highly developed civilization would pick up and move to a new place. And they didn't bring much of the stuff with them. They brought the knowledge with them. And the Mayflower Compact is a wonderful microcosm of the knowledge they brought. So the two main things are religion and moral philosophy. And the Mayflower Compact is expressive of those two things, and beautifully so.
Why did they pick up and go, though? You know, this is something that I think a lot of people in the era of the 1619 project, the only plausible reason for the Pilgrims to pick up and leave a highly developed civilization in Europe would be to come to America and commit genocide against the native inhabitants, or to act out their dominion over the earth and over all other peoples in a founding act of white supremacy. And that is literally how the Pilgrim story is taught in universities and high schools, and probably at this point in elementary schools as well. But there are other reasons for picking up and coming to the New World. And I wonder if you might comment on maybe, you know, what those might have been, and why Europe was not a place where something like the Mayflower Compact could be written and signed, and something like the Declaration of Independence also could not arise.
Yeah, well, the Mayflower Compact pays homage to King James, which monarch would not let them do that on English soil. The whole idea of establishing a government by compact, by agreement among some people. And that's both a broadly Christian idea and a Protestant idea. Well, it's three things, and a precept in moral philosophy that it all developed. Christianity has an interesting posture toward government. It's a universal religion that explicitly, by the words of the founder, does not establish a kingdom. And that means kingdoms, to be just, have to protect the practice of Christianity. And that means religious freedom is in fact, the limited government itself is born chiefly in the realization over time of this particular significance of Christianity. So that's the first thing. That's just broadly, that's what it is, right? It's very different from the religion of the Spartans. It's very different from the religion of the Persians. It's very different from the religion of the Jews. So there's that. And then these people are Protestants. And what's going on in Protestantism is the idea that we come together as volunteers to form a society to seek our salvation. And that is the religious parallel of the mechanism of government by consent. That's one of the main precepts of the Declaration of Independence. And so these people had worked all this out. By the time they left Holland for America, and they came for that, right? They didn't. It was if you just read the record and see, if you're a serious student of anything, if you stop and look at anything, you'll find out that there's an awful lot of candor in the world. So, like, if you want to know what Hitler thought, you can find out by reading Hitler. He tells us what he thought. Same thing with Stalin, right? They're liars and cheats and murderers on a mass scale, and yet they say what they're up to. So the point is, the Mayflower Compact, it says what it's up to. And indeed, it's a dramatic document because there was divisions among the people on the boat. And they'd already had a hard time and getting ready to have a worse time. And so they thought the way to maneuver through this was for us all to reach an agreement how we're going to behave. And that's awesome, right? That's freedom. That's compact. And so it's, just under pressure, they repair to that. That's where they think safety and efficacy lie. And that's deep, right? It's marvelous. And you don't really get things like that in the ancient world because religion was different and philosophy was different in some ways the same. And so, just think and then if you think of the unfolding of America, it's all implicit in that set of arrangements. The doctrine of equality is not in there, except implicitly, but powerfully implicitly, because they all have to sign it. Yeah. And so that's, and the point is get everybody together. And the people who were on the boat who were not Puritans, they called them strangers. And they were very concerned about them because they needed their help, but they wanted them to behave properly and were prepared to behave properly toward them. And so they make a compact with them. And that's, a very powerful thing.
And it strikes me too that this is not the kind of thing that we saw or could have seen in the Europeans who came to different parts of the New World. The development of European civilization in the Americas that was started by Catholics, that was started in Catholic Spain, in New Spain, in what is now Mexico and Central America. The culture, the institutions that developed were not built on this idea that you have to get everybody together and that you have to have a compact. They were the exportation of authoritarian, absolute monarchical rule from Europe to this new place, and it built in completely different institutions, so that 150 years later, when the American founding was taking place and the seeds that were planted by the Mayflower Compact were coming to fruition in places like Mexico and Central America, there were very different things afoot, and not just in the 18th century, but all the way into the 19th century. You had absolute monarchy contending with revolutionary insurgencies that didn't follow the American pattern at all. And now today you have on the same continent, over a shared border, completely different societies based on completely different sets of ideas about what government should be and how we should arrange our lives together. And that is a very powerful thing, I think, when you think about the ripple effects of something as simple maybe as the Mayflower Compact, as opposed to the declarations made by Spanish conquistadors when they landed on the coast of Mexico or Central America.
Yeah, I think, first of all, just ask the simple question, who's on the boat, right? So the English, the Spanish, right? They sent men You know, a bunch of men alone is an essentially dysfunctional society. And so they had priests and soldiers. And the English sent families. They called them plantations. And then they could grow and become self-sufficient because of that. In fact, the survival of Plymouth Colony was rooted in the fact that they were disciplined by the need to defend their loved ones. And then they could go, right? So, I mean, it's really great because, you know, the English did send one big bunch of men that landed in Roanoke, I think. And they, you know, settled down, built a fort, and went off, left a note, went off in the country. They're going to go explore. And they were never heard from again. And that's because it's just a bunch of men, right? And that won't work. And so it gives an entirely different direction and foundation, just that. And see, it meant that it was a evangelical or a military operation or both. And that's something different than founding a city, right? And it's less comprehensive set of aims. So it's completely different. I think I've been told, I don't really know, that most of the people in Mexico are descended from the people who lived there when the Europeans came. But most of the people in North America are descended from immigrants. And that, I don't know if that's true or not, but it stands to reason if it's true.
That's right, because the Spanish weren't really founding a society. They didn't come to create a polity. They came to conquer and to extract riches as best they could. And that was reflected not just in their initial contact with the natives of Central America and South America and Mexico, but in the institutions that they developed, the rancheros, the societies built around a boss, and patronage. You know, these are things that still exist in Mexico today. These social systems. They may be informal now, but they still exist, and they have resonated down the centuries in the same way that our systems, founded in part by the Pilgrims and later by the founders, resonate today. But I wonder, in our current moment in American history, where we do have this kind of revolution taking place, an intellectual revolution certainly, taking place about what America should be, about what it was, but really about what it should be. If we are not trying to recreate in a modern 21st century context the kind of patronage systems that would have been alien to the Pilgrims, certainly would have been alien to the founders, but would have been right at home in New Spain, among the conquistadors and the societies that they ruled in the New World.
Yeah, certainly, it's more like what we're developing now is more like those other European settlements in America than it's like the Pilgrims. But you have to remember this terrible difference. It's the same thing as the difference between ancient tyranny and totalitarianism. The introduction of the power of modern science, which is, of course, the most powerful possible means, but it's a means that's construed to be an end. The purpose of technology is the use and production of technology. And that means that we become subjects of an engineering project. And, you know, the priest who came, the Catholic priest who came to convert the existing inhabitants, well, you know, they may have done some wrong, but their purposes were ultimately charitable and were understood to be the completion of the life of people, that their own life was completed in the same way. right? Whereas the masters of technology, they look at us as something to move and manipulate. They think they can perfect the society, and just think, the reasons for things are always influential in how they play out. So the reason for those Mexican and Central American and South American settlements, the reason for it was to convert people to God and go find some gold. And chiefly, right? Well, to convert people to God, that's a concern for those people, right? But if you launch yourself into a utopian world, I'm full of this stuff right now because I just taught a class on totalitarian novels and I read a bunch of them. And, they're horrific and true, right? And so the thing is, that thing, and I think the New York Times thing, kindly meant, of course, I think it is expressive of that thing. If you can, in 1984, the protagonist is Winston Smith, named by George Orwell for Winston Churchill. And his job is to sit all day along with thousands of other people and rewrite the past. Every book, every article, every magazine, every encyclopedia, everything in the library. If the party changes its opinion about anything, if it changes its opinion about with whom we're at war, then everything is immediately rewritten. And that means the past is flowing past like a river. And that means, and see that it is a profound and terrible novel. That becomes explicit in the end, in the culmination of the novel. And it's the only philosophic seminar I know conducted under torture. But in the end, O'Brien, the representative of the big state, he tortures Winston and teaches him. And what he teaches him is that nothing is real. And the strongest proof of that is that the past itself is not only not real, it takes its reality from what I say, from my will, from the will of the party. And so I think the New York Times, I think that's what that is, right? In other words, those people, they're high-minded, fine people, but they want to have an effect upon us. And so they're prepared to malign, because, it just doesn't work, right? Where are the documents that show that the purpose of the European settlement of North America was to extend slavery? Because they don't exist, right? And of course they don't exist. And because it wasn't the purpose. It is true, by the way, that it happened in American history. It happened sometime between 1787 and 1800. We know this because the Northwest Ordinance is in 1787, and it forbids all slavery. And that was a general agreement by the whole Union in the new territory. And the Northwest Territory, by the way, was given by Virginia on the motion of Thomas Jefferson and on condition there be no slavery. But then 1800 comes and you have to have the Missouri Compromise for the Union to grow again, because now they're concerned keeping the numbers the same, the ratios between slave and free the same. And that means somewhere slavery gained some support. And come to find out, John C. Calhoun, the great disciple of all that, was a friend of a man named Francis Lieber at Yale. And Lieber was a descendant and connected to the people around Friedrich Hegel. And he taught them the doctrines of history. And that's what dominates the New York Times today, see. What those doctrines say is, you can read them in either of two ways. You can read them that there's a historical process, it places us at odds with each other, it's going somewhere, and eventually we'll have the end of the process and leap into freedom. Or you can say that it has made some of us into masters and others of us into slaves. That's Hitler and John Calhoun. The point is that got into America somewhere, but it didn't come with the first settlers.
Right.
And so, to understand that, if you really want to do something, about oppression, you need to learn the principles that establish it being wrong, and you need to learn the arguments and principles that assert that it's right. And you need to get those accurate, right? You need to go, unlike the New York Times, both Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas say, this alone is denied even to God, to make what has been not to have been.
Right. Your mention of Calhoun reminds me that my first reaction to the 1619 Project was a column that argued that the ghost of John C. Calhoun is haunting the American left, and that the American left today are the true inheritors of Calhoun's political philosophy. That Calhoun was the one who hated the Constitution, who wanted to find a way around it, and who thought that the founders were wrong, and he said so. He said so plainly, that it cannot be true that all men are created equal, and so he came up with his theory of the concurrent majorities and all these other ideas to get around the Constitution. And it seems to me he was a kind the father, if you will, of progressivism. People talk about Woodrow Wilson as the founder of modern progressivism, but the intellectual roots, the philosophical roots, it seems to me, stretch back to Calhoun.
Calhoun is people who haven't read the Disquisition on Government should read it in order to be able to brag that they did, because it's a hell of a mess. But there's a line in it that shows what Calhoun really was. It would be impious to think that God would give us the gift of modern science and permit us to use it for ill. You see, he's just a progressive. and it's just explicit in this book in various places, but that's the clearest one. And so how can a man think? Because what the concurrent majority means is every law in every jurisdiction, including the national jurisdiction, will be passed unanimously or not passed at all. And he thinks that can be made to work. There's a man detached from reality, big time, and, very philosophic. And there was cool things about Calhoun. He inherited from his fathers in the making of the American Union, which are not that long before him, by the way. He inherited the idea of a grand nation. But what went wrong was he added in the idea of a perfect nation. Master and slave, we are all aristocrats, we whites, because we own these blacks, right? We have our slaves. That makes us all aristocrats, even the ones who are not slaveholders. And, that was partly a political point, because the slaveholders were not wonderfully popular with the poor people like my ancestors in the South who were competing with the slaves. So, yeah, that's, and that utopianism is a key thing. I mean, if you just see this Black Lives Matter stuff and all that, we have to make it right now. And think of what we're doing to the young people, right? If you know anything about the story of race in America, first of all, it's a tragic story. Also relieved by greatness, but it moves in three main long periods. And I'm leaving out of account the Civil War, which is the wrenching struggle to get rid of it, slavery. First, there was slavery, and that was bad. And then after a time of liberation, and especially the efforts of Ulysses Grant, then Jim Crow. So we went into discrimination, right? And then beginning in about 1960, but a movement for it longer than that, we went into the age of race preferences, which is just another word for discrimination. And so there's never been a long sustained period in American history except leading up to and just after the Civil War, where the idea of equal human rights for all was the dominating notion. And that's too bad. and I don't even think that's an accident. I think that's a very hard principle to serve. And that means you're between a rock and a hard place, because if it's a hard principle to serve, that doesn't change the fact that it's the right principle to serve. And so our history has always been a struggle toward this thing that we articulate. And we have long periods where we give up on this thing and try to do something easier. And that's where the tragedies come. And the contemporary tragedy is, now we're going to pick them by color and advance some and debase others to make it up for the wrongs done in the past. And we lose our individuality in that, for one thing, because, you know, I come from Arkansas. My family was blessedly poor. They never had a slave. And so I stand in the same relation to slavery as John C. Calhoun under these principles that are taking over today.
That's right. And it's easy. It seems it's easy if you want to sort of sift through the American past for crimes and injustices, you know, for people like Nicole Hannah-Jones, the sort of, face of the 1619 Project. She doesn't have to go back. She can go back to the beginning, to the landing at Plymouth Rock and the Mayflower Compact, and say, well, this was a compact, and has said so. Only signed by men. Only the white men signed this. And so here we have evidence from the very moment the Pilgrims set foot on American shores that they were establishing what she calls a society based on white supremacy, white male supremacy. And it seems to me that their project, the New York Times, but the left's project more broadly, is at pains constantly to deny the overwhelming evidence that the American founding, from the Mayflower Compact through to the Declaration and the founding of the country, articulated these ideals and has worked arduously in fits and starts, as you said, toward these ideals, toward fulfilling this great idea that all men are created equal, but that the ideal wasn't cynical, it wasn't hypocritical when it was put down. That, in other words, the founders were sincere when they said all men are created equal. It seems to me that Hannah Nicole Jones and the New York Times and the left, it's an obstacle that they are at pains to overcome, to convince people that the founders were lying when the evidence seems overwhelming that they were not.
Well, the question of women is different from the question of race. So I grew up in the hills of Arkansas. Everybody from Arkansas is my cousin. And I knew both my grandmothers. And my grandmothers, one of them had 9, and one of them had 9, one of them had 8 children. And they basically worked on the farm night and day alongside their husbands. And they made a living, barely. And by the time the kids were grown, it was getting time for them to die. And so that was life, right, for everybody. And it isn't true that the man worked and the woman stayed at home.
Right.
Home was the farm. And right. They all worked it, all the parts of it.
And that was most of America for a long time.
That's it. Well, I think 2/3 of the people were farmers until well into the 20th century.
Yeah.
And, the tools that we use and stuff, that's changed a lot of things, right? But that's, this long legacy of woman oppression. You think my grandmothers didn't get their way when they wanted it? And my mother, for sure, whom I knew very well, or for that matter, my wife, right? We have a common project, my wife and me. Right. And our project is to run our family and my career. And we both do that. And that is our career, the combination of those two things. That's what we do together. And we both do both of them. And that's what, because Come to find out, human babies take a long time to raise, longer than other critters. And so it's going to take devotion to them in the beginning, mostly by the mother. And, at least in the very beginning. And so the point is, if you can't make, you're reducing human nature if you pretend that these biological facts are not facts. And, just today in the dining hall, here's a funny thing about Hillsdale College. We have just about the same number of men and women, a few more men, which is very rare in a liberal arts college. And they come in with exactly the same academic profile. And they do great. People do great here. But it is typical for the top 10 students in a senior class, 7 or 8 of them to be girls. Now, why is that? Well, it's not a difference in intelligence, I don't think. I think it's a difference in character. I explained it last term because 6 of my favorite boys ever, in all the many years I've been here, they get into a war with the dorm next door, throwing things that smell bad on each other. The key thing was deer urine. And then somebody said, I said it at commencement last summer, I said, why are the girls dominating the top 10? And the answer is they're not throwing deer urine on each other. So there's a difference, right? And it's not an intellectual difference. And it's true. Today, I go back to my point. Today at lunch, a bunch of girls and boys at a lunch table, and I was sitting with them. And the girls, I often ask them what they're going to do. And they've all got big plans. And the girls will sometimes say, and I'm going to have children. And the great majority of them intend to, whether they say it or not. And I always say, yeah, good for you. And good for you developing a career for yourself too. Because you're likely to live a lot longer than the child rearing years. And you will need something to do to make a contribution, to be a functioning human being. You need to do that. And you need to marry somebody who wants you to do that. And that's just nature, right? Mm-hmm. And you can, any evidence of, like if you read the diaries and letters of Abigail Adams, mm-hmm. that's a tremendous woman, right? And she was tough as nails. And of course, she was devoted to her husband. He was devoted to her. And she's the one who made that family work. And so honor to her, one of the great figures of American history. Yeah. And if it were modern times, things different now than they were then, I imagine she'd be a college professor or a college president, because she'd be better than I am at either of those things, and probably better than her husband. So I don't know. I think if you, and just remember, if you set your face against the functioning of the family, which changes with time and is a relatively fluid thing, and yet the basic relationships have been the same for as long as we know, right? If you set your face against that, then you've undertaken an engineering project that's going to mean a lot of violence to try to stamp that out. Mm-hmm. That's what Brave New World is about. They don't use violence. They just use overwhelming inducement to reduce people's lives. See, here's another thing. If you raise a child, that's a huge responsibility. That's a bigger responsibility than anybody gets in his job. Me, anybody. And so people should do that. For one thing, early in our lives and late in our lives, we're helpless. And we need the ones in the middle of years to take care of us. And so if we stop having babies, there won't be anybody. And so the family is a domain that's like a kingdom to the people who run it, husbands and wives and children. And that's an expression of freedom and independence that everyone needs, however important their job is. Because, I mean, we were talking about it before we started this. I became a grandfather 10 days ago, and there's a 6-pound baby living in my house right now. Our daughter's with us and her husband. And that thing is precious, and tiny and fragile. And it's going to need a lot of help for a long time. Right. And then but on the other hand, it's going to go fast.
Yeah.
And I like to say, when she turns 2, before then, little, she's going to start talking. And I like to say, in my family, we have boxer dogs and children, and they all hear the same things, but the children start talking and the dogs never do. But after they start talking, 3 months after that, they're going to know everything in the world. Okay. They don't even have to leave the house, you see? So the human soul is tremendous. It just takes years of cultivation for it to grow to be what it can be. And that point, that's a duty that we have. Or we can live in Brave New World where everything is done for us and we have no serious work to do in our lives.
And it strikes me, and we've had conversations at the Federalist about this recently, that Brave New World in some ways was more prescient than 1984. The world that we see emerging through big tech and through big government and through the progressive leftist ideology, even in some cases explicitly stated by groups like Black Lives Matter, who inveigh against the nuclear family, but a world where there are not families forming and there are not the responsibilities, the unchosen, in some cases, responsibilities that grounded people in families and in places and to one another in ways that lasted a long time. So we have a kind of Brave New World today where the rulers, the governors and mayors will impose a lockdown and assume that you're okay with your weed and your Netflix, and to not worry about anything, that you'll be taken care of. That seems to me to be much more the picture of the future of our present than the 1984, the totalitarian state, Big Brother watching over everything. In this case, Big Brother is a coddling brother. It's a brother that wants you to not worry and not take on responsibilities, and certainly not to form families, because that is the #1 threat to the state that is possible. Those loyalties. I guess we may have strayed away from the Pilgrims a bit, but it's all germane to the to the original point that that they came with families, and that says everything.
Mm-hmm. I think you're by the way, we have that same argument around here all the time, and we read both those novels in this class I taught, and 3 or 4 others. I think the people who think it's, first of all, Aldous Huxley was a teacher of French to George Orwell at Eton College, and they had a correspondence about who was right. Is the despotism going to be pleasure or pain? And Huxley was very confident that he was right, and the same for Orwell. I think the ones who think that Huxley is right are optimistic, because the society is not growing kinder, right? And we're more and more ready to hurt people. And I don't know how it's going to go, but I think bad elements of both are possible.
Yeah, it strikes me that that may very well may be. The signs are not good, and I think of the smashing of statues, this fad of smashing statues. The smashing of statues never stops with statues. After a while, the mob gets tired of smashing statues and monuments, and it moves on to people. And I think we saw maybe a little bit of that this summer, this spring and summer. And I fear that we'll see more.
Yeah, I do too.
And it strikes me that the only way for our country and hold fast to the principles and the ideas and the philosophies of the Mayflower Compact and the Declaration and the Constitution. And that's why we're doing the 1620 project, and why we wanted to talk to you. And maybe we'll go out on that note if there's a closing thought maybe you had on those subjects.
Well, we have to have a revival of learning because we're ignorant. And there's a legislator in this state. I think these tense events that are going on are good for us too. There's a legislator who announced in the hearing of one of my colleagues that the governor was the rightful leader of the legislature. And that's why she has the veto power. And, the ignorance of that is just awesome, right? But then he was thinking about that because of the pressure of these events. And this was pointed out to him. In a less serious time, it would have never come up. He would have just floated through his life, right? And so the person who heard this happened to be very knowledgeable about such things and explained to him the basic way that separation of powers works, which is the key part of the structure of American government. And it was like a revolutionary thing for the guy. And, they're trying to figure out in the Michigan legislature what to do about this pandemic and what to do about this election. And they're thinking more seriously about that than I have known them to do in the past. And so I'm not doing it myself, but I know people who are helping them. And I'm pleased about that. In other words, there's a lot of room for improvement, and there's a lot of reason to want to make it these days.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, we'll end on that optimistic note. I want to thank you, Dr. Arnn, for joining us. This has been another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. I'm John Davidson, political editor at the Federalist. And until next time, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.